Handcuffs snapped shut around Maria Torres's wrists. Just 24 hours earlier, in this same bank lobby, the manager had hugged her on live TV and called her the most honest woman in America. Now he wouldn't even look at her. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. A man in a gray suit dropped a thin folder onto the table. "We need to talk," he said. $2.3 million never made it back." Maria froze. She had returned every dollar. She had counted the cash herself before handing it over. So if nothing was missing, where had $2.3 million gone? And why was someone trying to convince the entire country that she had stolen it? Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. 3 weeks earlier, Maria Torres was just another face the city never noticed, and she had made a kind of peace with that. She was 34 years old, and if you looked closely at her hands, really looked, the way most people never bothered to, you could read her whole life story written across them. The small burn scar from a hospital floor buffer that had overheated on a night shift 2 winters ago. The calluses from wringing out mop after mop after mop, year after year, until the motion had become as automatic as breathing. The chipped polish she never had time to redo, because redoing it meant spending money on something that wasn't food, or rent, or her son. And Maria had long ago stopped being the kind of woman who spent money on herself first. She worked nights as a janitor at St. Augustine Regional Hospital, pushing a rolling cart down long fluorescent-lit hallways from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, cleaning up after other people's worst days. The blood, the vomit, the quiet, exhausted grief of families sitting in waiting rooms who didn't get the news they'd been praying for. On weekends, she picked up shifts at a laundromat 3 blocks from her apartment, folding strangers' clothes for $11 an hour, the hum of industrial dryers filling the silence where conversation used to be, back when she'd had the energy for conversation. 2 incomes from one exhausted body were still, most months, not quite enough to keep the lights on in a 1-bedroom apartment in a city that seemed to raise its rent every single year out of pure spite for people like her. She hadn't always lived like this. 3 years ago, Maria had a husband, and a life that had felt, for a while, like it might actually turn out the way she'd hoped. Marcus Torres worked in finance, a mid-level compliance analyst position at Meridian National that paid enough for them to dream, quietly, at night, about a small house with a yard someday, somewhere with good schools, somewhere their son could ride a bike down the street without his mother's heart climbing into her throat every time a car passed too fast. Then, 8 months before the accident that took his life, Marcus came home early one gray afternoon, sat down heavily at their kitchen table, and told Maria only that there had been a policy violation at work. That it was complicated, that he didn't want to talk about it, not yet, maybe not ever. Maria, who trusted her husband the way some people trust the sunrise, without question, without demand, without needing every detail explained, didn't push. She sat down across from him, took both his hands in hers, and told him they'd figure it out together, the way they always had. She never asked again, not once in the 8 months that followed, because Marcus had asked her, gently, not to, and she loved him enough to let him carry that silence in whatever peace he could find inside it. 8 months later, on a rain-slicked highway just after 11 at night, Marcus Torres died in a car accident that the police report described, in flat bureaucratic language, as an unfortunate combination of weather conditions and mechanical failure. Something about that explanation had never quite settled right in Maria's chest, a small cold unease she couldn't name and didn't have the energy to chase. Grief doesn't leave much room for suspicion. Grief leaves you just enough energy to survive the next hour, and then the hour after that, and then, somehow, the next 3 years. So she survived. She found the janitor job within 6 weeks of the funeral, because 6 weeks was as long as their savings lasted. She found the laundromat job not long after, because one paycheck, even a steady one, wasn't enough to cover both rent and the growing needs of a boy who seemed to get taller every time she blinked. She raised her son alone in a city that barely seemed to notice either of them, and she did it without complaint, because complaining felt like a luxury reserved for people who had time to spare for it. and Maria didn't have time. She had a 9-year-old boy who needed breakfast before school, and a mother who needed to be standing upright at the bus stop by 5:20 in the morning to make it to the hospital before her shift began. Every single one of those mornings, on her walk to catch the first bus, Maria passed Meridian National Bank. It had become so routine it was almost invisible. A tall glass building on the corner of 9th and Kessler, its windows dark except for the small, steady blue glow of the ATM vestibule light. She had walked past that building probably close to 1,000 times in the 3 years since Marcus died, and it had never once, not for a single second, occurred to her to wonder what happened inside those walls before the sun came up, or what her husband's old job had actually looked like from the inside, or whether the silence he'd carried home that afternoon 3 years ago had anything to do with the building she passed without a second glance every morning of her life. She had no idea that this ordinary, forgettable walk, this exact sidewalk, this exact hour, this same tired rhythm of footsteps she could have performed in her sleep, was about to become the most consequential 10 minutes of her entire life. There was a particular ritual to those mornings that Maria could have recited in her sleep. She left the apartment at 5:04, always exactly 5:04, because the bus that mattered came at 5:31 and there was no room in her schedule for anything less precise than that. She wore the same gray zip-up hoodie over her hospital scrubs, because it was the warmest thing she owned that still fit properly after 3 years of skipped meals had quietly reshaped her body into something smaller than it used to be. She carried a thermos of coffee she made from the same generic grounds every week. The kind that came in a can twice the size of the name-brand bag for half the price. She passed the same closed nail salon, the same shuttered taco stand with its metal grate pulled down, the same stretch of 9th Street where the streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, like they were tired too. And every single morning, without exception, she passed Meridian National Bank, tall and dark in glass, its lobby a rectangle of dim blue light in an otherwise sleeping city block. She never looked up at it. There was no reason to. It was simply part of the landscape of her grief, the way a scar becomes part of the landscape of skin, always there, never noticed, until something eventually presses on it hard enough to remind you it exists. Sometimes, on the harder mornings, Maria let herself think about Marcus during that walk, because the quiet dark gave her permission to feel things she didn't have room for during daylight hours, when Eli needed her steady, and the hospital needed her focused. She thought about the way he used to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror before early meetings, small dumb jokes, just to make her laugh before her day even started. She thought about the sound of his laugh, which she was starting to fear she might be forgetting, the exact pitch of it, the way it used to fill up their old kitchen. She thought about the afternoon he came home early with that strange, careful stillness in his voice, the policy violation he never explained, and the promise she'd made herself, silently, standing at that kitchen table with his hands in hers, that she would trust him without asking twice. She had kept that promise for 3 years even after he was gone. She didn't know yet that keeping it was about to lead her directly back to the one building in the entire city that had taken him from her, long before that highway ever did. At home, her son Eli was 9 years old, sharp-eyed and quiet in the particular way children become quiet when they've learned, far too young, that money is something adults worry about in whispers behind closed doors, in the hush after the lights go out. A few days before everything changed, Eli had asked his mother, in the small, careful voice he used when he already suspected the answer wasn't going to be one he liked, why they couldn't afford the $40 fee for his class field trip to the Science Museum. Maria smiled the way she always smiled when the truth would only hurt him. "Next month, mijo," she said, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "I promise you." She skipped lunch for the next 2 weeks, telling herself she simply wasn't hungry, telling her co-workers at the hospital that she'd already eaten whenever they offered to split something, and on the morning of the trip she slid 2 crumpled $20 bills into the front pocket of Eli's backpack without saying a word, so that he would never know exactly what it had cost her, only that his mother had somehow, impossibly, made it happen again, the way she always seemed to. That was who Maria Torres was, underneath all the exhaustion and the worry lines and the years of quiet sacrifice nobody ever saw. Not a hero in the grand cinematic way movies define heroes, just a woman who gave up her own meals so her son could see dinosaur bones at a museum, who folded strangers' laundry with the same gentle care she folded her son's, who had absolutely no idea that her honesty, the same honesty that made her skip lunch instead of telling her son the truth about their struggle, was about to be tested on a scale no one could have possibly prepared her for. If you wanted to understand why Maria Torres would go on to do something as remarkable as what she was about to do, you only had to look at her son. Eli Torres was 9 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark, serious eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. He was the kind of child teachers described in parent-teacher conferences as mature beyond his years, a phrase that always made Maria's chest ache a little when she heard it, because she knew exactly why he was mature beyond his years. He had been forced to grow up faster than any child should have to. Eli noticed things other kids didn't notice. He noticed when his mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes at the end of a long shift. He noticed when she said, "I already ate," a beat too quickly, like a line she'd rehearsed in the mirror. He noticed the stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen counter that seemed to grow a little taller every week. The ones marked "Final Notice" in angry red ink that his mother would quietly slide beneath the fruit bowl, as if hiding them from view somehow made the numbers printed inside smaller. What Maria didn't know, because Eli, in his own 9-year-old way, had been protecting her right back the entire time, was that her son had quietly sold nearly all of his old toys at a second-hand shop 2 bus stops away. His action figures, still in decent condition, went for a few dollars each. A remote control car his father had given him for his 6th birthday. The very last gift Marcus ever gave him before the accident went for $6 to a stranger behind a counter who didn't ask any questions. Eli told his mother he had given it to a kid at school who needed it more. Because he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, that he'd noticed the grocery money running short toward the end of certain months, and he wanted, in some small, invisible way, to help without ever letting her know he'd noticed anything was wrong at all. His teacher, Ms. Alvarez, mentioned once at a parent-teacher conference that Eli had a habit of quietly checking on classmates who seemed upset, offering half of his own lunch without being asked, the way a much older child might. "He notices when people are struggling," she told Maria, not knowing quite how close to home the observation landed. "He's got a good heart, an old soul some people would call it." Maria had smiled and thanked her and driven home with tears blurring the edges of the road because she knew exactly where that old soul had come from, and she wasn't entirely sure it was a gift she'd meant to give him. That was the kind of boy Eli was. Sensitive, protective, carrying a weight no child should ever have to carry, and carrying it quietly, the way his mother had unknowingly taught him to, simply by example. There was another figure in this story who mattered just as much, though the world wouldn't understand why until much later. His name was Walter Higgins, 71 years old, a retired then rehired security guard who worked the overnight shift in the parking structure attached to Meridian National Bank. He was a heavy-set man with kind, tired eyes and a habit of talking to the empty parking garage at 3 in the morning, just to hear a human voice, even his own. Walter was the only other living soul awake on that block at 5:12 in the morning when Maria's world changed forever. Through the reinforced glass of his small security booth, he watched a woman he didn't recognize stop dead in her tracks on the sidewalk outside the bank's side entrance, staring down at 2 black duffel bags that had clearly, impossibly, been left behind. Abandoned, unattended, unzipped just enough at the top for a slice of green to catch the streetlight, in the deep blue dark of a city that hadn't woken up yet. Walter had a story of his own, one he didn't share with strangers, but one that explained everything about what he did next. 15 years earlier, he had worked security at a manufacturing plant whose executives, it eventually came out, had spent nearly a decade quietly embezzling from the company's employee pension fund. When the fraud finally surfaced, Walter, along with almost 300 other loyal, hard-working employees, lost nearly his entire retirement in a single devastating afternoon of headlines and lawyers and apologetic form letters that changed nothing. He'd had to start over in his late 50s, taking whatever work he could find, eventually ending up standing in a cold booth overnight, watching over cars that weren't his, guarding money that would never be his either, in a life that looked nothing like the one he'd spent 40 years building. So when Walter Higgins saw a tired-looking woman standing over 2 bags, stuffed with more cash than either of them had likely ever seen in one place in their entire lives, and he saw the flicker of fear cross her face, followed immediately by the very human, very understandable flicker of temptation, the fleeting thought of what that kind of money could mean for a struggling single mother, Walter didn't hesitate for even a second. He stepped out of his booth into the cold morning air, his knees aching the way they always did before sunrise, and said the only thing he knew, in his bones, to be right. "Ma'am, don't touch it. Call the police. Do it by the book." His voice was low and steady, worn smooth by years of quiet conviction. "I've seen what happens to people who don't do things by the book, and I've seen what it costs the ones who do it right too, but at least at the end of it, you get to keep your name. That's worth more than you think it is right now." "I know it's a lot of money," Walter added more gently, watching her face carefully in the dim light. "I know what it could mean for you. I'm not blind and I'm not stupid. I can see the scrubs. I can see the bus pass sticking out of your pocket. I know what a woman like you doesn't have. But money like that always comes with strings nobody shows you until it's too late. Do this the right way, and whatever happens after, at least you'll be able to look your kid in the eye." Maria stood frozen for a long moment on that dark sidewalk, the 2 duffel bags open at her feet, more cash inside them than she would earn in 100 years of double shifts. She thought for one dizzying second about Eli's field trip money, about the eviction letters she hadn't gotten yet but somehow already dreaded, about a life where she never again had to skip a meal so her son could eat. And then she thought about the years Marcus had spent building a life around doing things the right way, and about the boy sleeping in their apartment who was already, at 9 years old, watching every single thing she did, and quietly deciding what kind of person he wanted to become because of it. She pulled out her phone and dialed the police before she let herself think about it for 1 second longer. It was Walter's insistence, his hard-won, unshakable belief that honesty had to be absolute, immediate, and undeniable, that pushed Maria toward the decision that would come to define the next month of her entire life. Later that day, on the local evening news, a young reporter crouched down to Eli's eye level outside their apartment building and asked him, live on camera, what he thought about what his mother had done. Eli, without a second of hesitation, without any idea that his answer was about to be clipped, captioned, and shared across the internet 11 million times within 24 hours, looked directly into the camera and said, "If I ever found $1 million, I'd give it back too. Because that's what my mom taught me." That single sentence, spoken by a serious-eyed 9-year-old boy with his father's face, was the moment Maria Torres stopped being a private woman with a private struggle and became a name the entire country recognized. It was the moment the whole world, for one brief, shining, unsuspecting week, decided to fall in love with her. It was also, though no one, least of all Maria, knew it yet, the exact moment that made her the perfect person for someone else to blame. Richard Colston did not look like a villain. That was, in fact, the entire foundation of everything he had ever built. At 52 years old, he was Senior Vice President of Private Banking at Meridian National, a man with a jaw like it had been drawn by an architect, a smile that made board members feel personally, individually chosen the moment it landed on them, and a laugh that arrived exactly on cue at every charity gala, every donor dinner, every quiet golf course conversation where the real decisions of the bank were actually made. He had been profiled twice in the city's business journal as the future of ethical banking. He coached his daughter's youth soccer team on Saturday mornings, arriving with orange slices and a genuine easy warmth that made other parents like him instantly. At the previous spring's Hospital Foundation Gala, a black tie event Colston attended every single year, always seated near the front, always the first to raise his paddle when the auction began, he had personally pledged $50,000 to a pediatric wing renovation, a gesture that made the front page of the Business Journal's Society section and earned him a standing ovation from a room full of people who had no idea that the very same week, He had quietly moved another $80,000 out of a client's trust account and into Ashcombe Holdings without leaving a single obvious trace behind. He had learned, over 2 decades, that generosity in public was the cheapest, most effective insurance policy a man in his position could ever buy. Nobody suspects the man writing the biggest check in the room. He was, by every visible measure available to the public, exactly the kind of man institutions built their entire reputations around. But there was a version of Richard Colston that only existed in stairwells, in the 90 seconds between meetings, in the moments when he was certain, absolutely certain, that no one was watching. 3 days before Maria found the bags, a junior employee heading down from the 14th floor caught a glimpse of Colston in the emergency stairwell, phone pressed hard against his ear, and for just a moment, before he noticed he wasn't alone, his face wasn't warm anymore. It wasn't charming, wasn't easy, wasn't the face from the business journal. It was pale and tight and unmistakably afraid. "I told you I'm handling it," he was hissing into the phone. His voice dropped down to something barely recognizable as the same man who'd charmed a room full of donors the night before. "Don't call me at this number again." He hung up, glanced up, saw the employee frozen at the bottom of the stairs, and by the time the elevator doors opened a floor later, the smile was back. Seamless, effortless, like nothing at all had happened. The employee mentioned it to no one. Executives got stressed. That was normal. What wasn't quite as normal, though it took a few more days for anyone to notice the pattern buried underneath it, was that when the news broke about the missing bank transport and Maria's astonishing discovery, Colston personally, and somewhat unusually for a man of his seniority, requested to be the one who personally verified the recovered funds before the official count was finalized. Standard protocol called for 2 independent auditors from the compliance department to handle any recovered asset verification, precisely to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. Colston overrode that protocol without much resistance, citing the sensitivity of the situation and optics for the board in a memo that nobody at his level had any reason to question. He was, after all, beloved. Beloved men rarely get asked to explain themselves. At the public thank you ceremony 3 days later, the one broadcast on every local news station in the region, the one where the bank's CEO stood on a small temporary stage in the marble lobby and called Maria Torres a shining example of the values this institution was built on, while the assembled crowd applauded and a giant novelty check with her name on it gleamed under the studio lights. Colston stood beside her for the photographs, his hand resting on her shoulder just a beat too long. His smile wide and warm and utterly convincing for every single camera in the room. And in the 2 seconds between the flash of one camera and the next, while everyone else in the room was looking somewhere else entirely, he leaned down slightly and said, quietly enough that only Maria could hear it, words that would echo in her mind for weeks afterward, long after the cameras had moved on to someone else's story. "You have no idea what you just walked into." Maria laughed it off in the moment, assumed she'd misheard him over the noise, assumed nerves and 2 straight days without real sleep were playing tricks on her overloaded mind. She had, after all, just returned $20 million in cash and hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since finding it. Surely a bank executive, a man being praised on television for his institution's integrity, wouldn't say something so strange, so genuinely unsettling, on the happiest, most surreal day of her entire life. That night, while Maria was home tucking Eli into bed, replaying the whole impossible day in her mind, and wondering, for the first time in years, whether things might actually be about to get easier for them, Richard Colston was 3 miles across the city in a dimly lit parking garage on the east side of town, meeting a man whose face he clearly did not want to see again as long as he lived. The man said nothing. He simply handed Colston a phone, not Colston's own phone, with a single text message already open on the screen, the cursor blinking patiently beside it, as though it had all the time in the world. 2.3 isn't enough. Fix it by Friday or everyone finds out. Colston's hand trembled as he read it a second time, and then a third. He deleted nothing because there was nothing to delete on a phone that wasn't his. He handed it back in silence, his throat too tight to form words. The man walked away without another sound, footsteps echoing off the concrete until they faded entirely. Colston stood alone under a flickering fluorescent garage light for nearly 4 full minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs before he trusted himself to drive home. He was being blackmailed. He was cornered, in a way he had never once let himself imagine he could be cornered, by someone who knew exactly what he had done and exactly how much it would cost him to have it come out. And somewhere in the desperate, spiraling calculations of a man watching his entire carefully constructed life threaten to collapse in on itself, a terrible thought had already begun quietly to take shape. He sat in his car in that garage for a long time after the man was gone, running numbers in his head the way he always did when he was afraid. Not moral numbers, never moral numbers, just numbers. How much he could move, how fast, through how many accounts, before anyone with real authority thought to look closely. He had been managing the gap between what client trust accounts were supposed to hold and what they actually held for almost 3 years now, patching one hole with funds borrowed quietly from somewhere else. The way a man bails water out of a boat with a hole he refuses to admit is there. It had always somehow worked. The bank's internal audits were thorough but predictable, and Colston knew exactly where the blind spots lived, because he had spent 2 decades helping to design the very systems meant to catch people like him. But blackmail was not a system. Blackmail did not wait politely for a quarterly audit cycle. Blackmail wanted $2.3 million by Friday, in a form Colston did not currently have sitting anywhere he could reach it without triggering exactly the kind of scrutiny he'd spent years avoiding. And then, almost as if the universe itself were mocking him, the $20 million transport had gone missing and reappeared in the hands of a single mother the entire city was suddenly obsessed with. It was, Colston told himself later, driving home with his knuckles white on the wheel, almost too perfect not to use. He needed someone the public would believe was capable of taking $2.3 million and simply keeping it. And the public had just spent an entire, glowing news cycle falling in love with a tired single mother who had never in her life held that kind of money in her hands, which to a man like Richard Colston staring down the barrel of his own exposure, made her the single most convenient person in the entire world to accuse. The morning after the ceremony, Maria woke up to 17 missed calls. She assumed, at first, still half asleep and smiling faintly at the memory of the day before, that it was more reporters. In the 3 days since she'd found the bags, her phone had become a stranger to her, buzzing constantly with numbers she didn't recognize. Producers from national morning shows, a literary agent who wanted to talk about her story, a woman claiming to represent a talk show that wanted her and Eli to fly out that same week, all expenses paid. It had been overwhelming, and if Maria was honest with herself in the quiet moments between calls, it had also been a little bit wonderful. For the first time in 3 years, people were looking at Maria Torres and seeing someone worth admiring, instead of someone to quietly feel sorry for on their way past. That feeling lasted exactly until 8:47 that morning, when she flipped on the small television propped on her kitchen counter to make Eli's breakfast, and saw her own face fill the screen beneath a headline that made her drop the spatula she was holding straight onto the floor. Bank auditors, $2. 3 million missing from recovered funds. The bank's chief financial officer stood at a podium, not the same warm celebratory lobby as the day before, but a sterile press conference room with harsh overhead lighting, and read from a prepared statement in a flat, careful, lawyer-approved voice. The recovered total, once verified by internal audit, had come in $3 million short of the amount originally reported stolen from the transport vehicle. The statement did not name Maria Torres. It didn't have to. Every camera in that room cut immediately, almost gleefully, to file footage of her from the day before, holding the bank's oversized novelty check. Laughing. Radiant. Completely unaware. By 10 o'clock, Maria's phone rang with a different kind of call altogether. A bank representative, polite, careful, using soft, deliberately vague words like routine and just a formality, asked if she would be willing to come in voluntarily to answer a few additional questions about the timeline of that morning. She said yes immediately. Of course she said yes. She had nothing in the world to hide. What Maria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that Richard Colston had spent the previous night doing something far more calculated than simply deleting a threatening text message. Under the pretense of reviewing footage ahead of the press conference, he had gone into the bank's internal security office, alone, using his full executive access, and there, quietly, methodically, he had introduced an 11-minute gap into the timestamp metadata of the surveillance footage covering the exact window when Maria had stood alone on the sidewalk with the bags before Walter reached her. It wasn't hard, not for a man who had spent 3 careful days privately learning precisely how the audit trail system worked, and precisely where its weaknesses lived. It wasn't a perfect job either. A skilled forensic analyst would eventually find the seams if they looked hard enough. But it was enough. It was enough to raise a question. And in the world Richard Colston had spent 20 years learning to navigate, a well-placed question was very often more dangerous than any outright lie. The voluntary questioning Maria walked into that afternoon stopped feeling voluntary within the first 15 minutes. She sat alone in a windowless conference room across from 2 internal bank investigators and a man from an outside auditing firm, none of whom bothered to introduce themselves with any real warmth. There was no lawyer beside her. She hadn't thought she'd need one, hadn't been told by anyone that she might want one, and no advocate of any kind sitting in that room to speak on her behalf. She answered every single question as honestly as she had answered anything in her entire life. What time she'd left her apartment that morning, exactly what she saw, exactly what she did, who she called first, how long it took for Walter to reach her, how long it took for the police to arrive after that. 2 hours in, one of the investigators slid a printed still frame across the table toward her. A timestamp blinking in the corner, a visible gap in the sequence. "Can you explain," he asked, in a voice that had long since stopped sounding like a formality, "why the footage shows you alone with the recovered funds for 11 minutes, entirely unaccounted for?" Maria stared down at the paper. Her stomach dropped somewhere she hadn't known it could reach. There wasn't a gap," she said, her voice cracking slightly around the edges. "Walter came out almost right away. I called it in the second I understood what I was looking at. Mr. Higgins's shift logs from that morning don't match the bank's official timeline," the second investigator cut in, not unkindly exactly but not gently either. "We're reviewing his account separately." "I want to help you understand something," the lead investigator said, leaning back in his chair, with the particular calm of a man who had run this exact conversation 100 times before. "Nobody in this room thinks you're some kind of criminal mastermind, Ms. Torres. That's not what this looks like from where we're sitting. What it looks like is a woman under a lot of financial pressure who found herself alone with an extraordinary amount of money for 11 unaccounted minutes, and who maybe made one understandable mistake in a moment of panic. If that's what happened, this is the time to say so. It gets much harder to say later." "Nothing happened in those 11 minutes, Maria said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled in her lap. "Because those 11 minutes didn't happen. I called it in the second I understood what I was looking at. Ask Walter, he'll tell you exactly how fast he came out of that booth." "We're asking Walter," the second investigator said quietly, sliding a second printout across the table. A duty roster with a highlighted discrepancy circled in red pen. "His logged arrival time doesn't match the footage timestamp either." Maria stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. She wanted to reach across the table and explain, slowly, carefully, that numbers could be wrong, that machines could be wrong, that she had lived through enough of her own life to know that paperwork didn't always tell the truth even when people did. But she could hear, even as the thought formed, exactly how that would sound coming out of her mouth in a room like this one. Desperate. Convenient. Exactly what a guilty person would say. She answered every remaining question as calmly as she could manage, though her voice cracked twice, and by the end of it her shirt was damp with sweat despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. When they finally told her she was free to go, for now, the words landed strangely, like a threat wearing the costume of a kindness. Maria left the building 3 hours later with her hands shaking so badly that she had to sit on a bus bench for nearly 10 minutes before she trusted herself to stand up straight and walk. She hadn't been arrested. Not yet. But she understood, with a cold, settling clarity that seemed to seep into her bones, that somewhere in the last 24 hours, the story of her own life had quietly been rewritten by people she had never even met. And she had absolutely no idea who was pulling the strings, or why the timeline she remembered with perfect, sleepless clarity no longer matched what the bank's own cameras now claimed to show. Outside the interrogation room, waiting in the hallway with nothing to do but stare at institutional carpet tile, Maria replayed the last 3 years of her life over and over, searching for anything she might have missed. Some sign, some clue, some moment where the ground had quietly started shifting beneath her without her noticing. She found nothing. That was, in its own way, the most unsettling part of all. She had done nothing wrong. And yet she was sitting in a hallway outside a room where strangers were deciding, in real time, whether or not to believe her. She thought, unbidden, of Marcus, of the policy violation he had never fully explained, the silence she had respected out of love and never once questioned. A small, cold thread of suspicion began to tug quietly at the back of her mind that afternoon, one she didn't yet have the language or the evidence or the strength to follow all the way to its end. That evening, alone at her kitchen table long after Eli had gone to bed, she pulled out an old shoebox of Marcus's things she hadn't touched in over 2 years. His work badge, a few loose business cards, a single folded sheet of paper with handwriting she didn't recognize as his own. She stared at it for a long time without understanding what she was looking at, then folded it carefully back into the box, telling herself it was nothing. Telling herself grief made people see patterns where none existed. She had no way of knowing, sitting there in the quiet dark of her kitchen, just how wrong that assumption was about to prove to be. Somewhere across the city, in his corner office with the door closed and the blinds drawn, Richard Colston watched the local evening news confirm that a person of interest was now being formally looked at in connection with the missing funds, and allowed himself, for the first time in 4 sleepless days, to breathe out slowly. He had bought himself time. He had absolutely no idea yet how little of it was actually left. Grief moves slowly. Public shame moves at the speed of the internet, and it does not wait politely for anyone to catch up. Within 36 hours of the auditor's announcement, a tabloid website ran a story under the blaring headline, "Good Samaritan or Con Artist? The Troubling Past of the Bank Bag Mom." The article, thin on verified facts and heavy on breathless insinuation, dug up a 2-year-old dispute Maria had once had over an unpaid parking ticket. A simple clerical mistake that had been resolved, paid and formally closed within a single month, and stretched it, with the kind of language usually reserved for actual criminal patterns, into a troubling history of financial disputes. They ran an old, deeply unflattering photograph of her from a courthouse hallway, taken during that same minor dispute, the kind of photo that makes absolutely anyone look guilty of something, positioned right next to a glowing, professionally lit photo of Richard Colston in a tailored charcoal suit, described in the very same article as the bank executive working tirelessly to protect customers' trust in a difficult time. The story spread the way stories like that always spread, faster, wider, and far more permanently than any correction that might follow ever could hope to travel. By the end of that week, Maria was called into the hospital's human resources office. Her supervisor, a kind woman named Denise, who had worked alongside Maria for 4 solid years and genuinely liked her, couldn't quite bring herself to meet Maria's eyes across the desk. "It's not a termination," Denise said carefully, clearly reading from language someone else had written for her. "We're placing you on unpaid leave, pending the resolution of the investigation. It isn't personal, Maria, I promise you it isn't. The hospital simply can't have this kind of media attention on staff members right now, not with the accreditation review coming up." Maria understood immediately, with a sinking finality, exactly what unpaid leave pending resolution actually meant in practice. It meant she had lost her job. The hospital simply wasn't willing to say the word out loud. 2 days later, Eli came home from school with red, swollen eyes and refused to speak a single word through dinner. pushing rice around his plate without eating any of it. It took nearly an hour of gentle coaxing, sitting together on his bed with the lights low, before he finally broke, his small shoulders shaking with the effort of holding it in. "Kids at school saw the news," he whispered, not looking at her. "They said you stole money, Tyler said you're a liar, and then everyone laughed." He looked up at his mother then, and the question that came out of him next was the one that would haunt Maria for the rest of her life, regardless of how the story eventually ended. "Mom," his voice cracked in the middle of her name. "Did you take the money?" Maria knelt down in front of her son on the worn carpet, took both of his small hands in hers, and looked him directly, steadily, unflinchingly in the eyes, because a child that age can always tell the difference between a mother who is telling the truth and a mother who is only performing one for his benefit. "No, baby," she said. "I gave every single dollar back. Every one. I promise you, on your father's memory, I did not take a single cent that wasn't mine. Somebody out there is lying, and I don't know why yet, and I don't know who. But it isn't me. You know me, Eli. You know your mother better than anyone in this world." Eli nodded slowly, and hugged her so tightly around the neck that it hurt, and Maria held him back and let herself cry silently over his shoulder where he couldn't see her face. Because a mother is allowed to be afraid, she is simply not allowed to let her child watch just how afraid she really is. The following week brought a fresh blow. Maria's landlord, a man she had paid rent to faithfully for 3 straight years, sometimes even a few days early when she could manage it, handed her a 30-day notice citing a vague lease violation clause about activities that negatively impact the reputation of the property. There had been no complaints filed about Maria in 3 years. There had been no actual violation of anything. There had only been headlines, and a landlord who did not want his building's name appearing anywhere near hers in the next news cycle. It was financial abuse dressed carefully up in bureaucratic language, and there was almost nothing Maria could do to fight it. She had no lawyer. She had no meaningful savings left after weeks without a paycheck. She had a 9-year-old son, a job she could no longer walk into, and 30 days on the clock to find somewhere else in the entire city for the two of them to live. She spent that night making phone calls to every relative she had left, most of whom offered sympathy but no spare bedroom, and one, an aunt in another state, who offered a spare bedroom but warned, gently, that Eli would need to change schools mid-year. Maria thanked her, hung up, and sat alone in the dark kitchen for a long time, staring at the eviction notice under the same dim light where, weeks later, she would sit again with a very different piece of paper in her hands. She thought about calling a tenants' rights hotline she'd seen advertised once on a city bus, but the number for legal aid rang through to a recorded message about high call volume, and she didn't have it in her, that particular night, to sit on hold for 2 hours only to be told there was nothing anyone could do about a vaguely worded lease clause, and a landlord who had already made up his mind. She thought about asking Denise or one of her other co-workers if anyone knew of a cheaper place, but the shame of it, of having to explain again that the headlines were lying, that she needed help because of something she hadn't done, kept her from picking up the phone. Instead, she opened the small savings envelope she kept taped behind a dresser drawer, counted what was left of it twice, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 2 in the morning, that even a stripped-down apartment in a rougher part of the city was still going to be a stretch within 30 days. Eli found her there near midnight, unable to sleep himself, and without a word climbed into her lap the way he hadn't done since he was much younger, resting his head against her shoulder. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Outside, a siren passed somewhere in the distance and faded. Maria kissed the top of her son's head and made herself a quiet promise that night, the kind she rarely allowed herself to make out loud even to herself. Whatever happened next, however this ended, she was not going to let this boy grow up believing that doing the right thing had been a mistake. Meanwhile, unseen by anyone outside the bank's executive floor, Richard Colston sat at his desk long after everyone else had gone home, and quietly transferred funds between 2 accounts that on the surface appeared to have nothing whatsoever to do with the missing $2. $3 million. Accounts that wouldn't mean anything at all to an outside observer glancing at them now, but that a sharp, patient investigator would eventually recognize as the very first breadcrumbs of a much older, much larger trail of theft stretching back years. Not everyone turned away from her. A handful of hospital co-workers, Denise included, started a small collection jar in the break room, without telling their supervisors, sliding in $5 and $10 bills between shifts and leaving the jar, along with a grocery gift card, on Maria's porch one evening without a note attached. A woman from Eli's school, a mother of one of the boys who'd been unkind to him in the hallway, showed up at Maria's door with a casserole dish and an awkward, sincere apology on behalf of her son, admitting that the whole family had believed the headlines before thinking to ask a single question. These small kindnesses didn't undo anything. They didn't pay the rent, or bring back the job, or make the eviction notice disappear, but they were, Maria would say much later, the thin thread that kept her from giving up entirely during the worst of it. Proof that not everyone had decided who she was based on a headline alone. Maria had no idea any of this was happening 3 floors above the lobby where she'd once been applauded. All she knew, lying awake that night beside her sleeping son in a home they had 30 days left to keep, was that her life, which had been hard but stable for 3 long years, was now collapsing in every direction at once. Her job, her home, her son's sense of safety, her own name printed under a headline that called her a liar, and she still did not understand why, or who was truly doing this to her, or how much further it was going to go before someone, anyone, finally believed her. Not everyone inside Meridian National believed the official story. One man in particular could not stop staring at the numbers, long after everyone else had gone home for the night. Daniel Reyes was 31 years old, a compliance analyst 2 floors below Colston's corner office, the kind of quiet, meticulous employee most executives couldn't have picked out of a lineup of 10 people. He had been assigned, almost as an afterthought during a busy week, to the routine post-incident audit trail review. The unglamorous, tedious paperwork that follows any major financial incident, checking carefully that every dollar's movement matched a documented, defensible explanation somewhere in the bank's records. Something didn't add up, and it bothered him in the particular way that only a genuinely careful person can be bothered by a small inconsistency. The $2.3 million reported missing from the recovered total didn't correspond to any withdrawal, transfer, or discrepancy anywhere in the bank's actual internal ledgers from that period. As far as the real accounting records were concerned, that specific sum of money had never existed as part of the original transport total in the first place. It wasn't missing. It had simply never been there to begin with. In the number everyone in the press and the public was now furiously chasing. Daniel sat with that discovery for 2 full days before he let himself do anything about it, because he understood exactly what he might be looking at, and exactly how dangerous it could become to look any further. He had his own private reasons for caring more than the job strictly required of him. Years earlier, his mother had been wrongly accused of shoplifting at a department store. A case of mistaken identity, a security guard too eager to make an arrest look good on a slow shift, a legal mess that took 11 humiliating months to fully clear from her record. Daniel still remembered sitting in the courtroom gallery as a teenager, watching his mother's good name get dragged through a process that never should have touched her at all, remembering the specific helpless fury of watching someone's entire life get quietly rearranged by people who never once bothered to check the facts before acting. He had never forgotten what that felt like from the outside. He was not going to let it happen again to a total stranger without at least, quietly, looking. So, after hours, using system access he technically still held but was no longer strictly supposed to use for this particular purpose, Daniel began pulling wire transfer records reaching back over a full year. It took him 11 separate nights of careful, unpaid work squeezed in around his actual job duties before he finally found it. A shell company called Ashcombe Holdings, which had quietly received a long series of wire transfers from Meridian National over the previous 14 months. Every single one of those transfers had been personally authorized by Richard Colston. Every single one had been carefully, deliberately sized to land just under the specific dollar threshold that would automatically trigger a mandatory compliance review. It wasn't proof of anything yet, it was a thread. thin and easily missed. But Daniel had spent his entire career learning that threads, pulled patiently and carefully enough, eventually unravel whole garments. He kept a small notebook at home, separate from any work system that could be traced, where he wrote out the timeline in his own careful handwriting, cross-referencing dates and dollar amounts by hand, the way his old college professor had taught him, back before spreadsheets did all the thinking for people. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., the blue glow of his kitchen table lamp the only light in the apartment while his wife slept down the hall, unaware of what he was risking with every file he opened. He told himself, each night, that he would stop after just one more record, one more transfer, one more name, and each night the trail pulled him one step further in. He thought often about his mother's case, about the exact moment 11 months in, when a young public defender, exhausted and overworked but stubborn, had finally found the security footage that cleared her name. He remembered his mother's face in the courtroom when the judge read the dismissal. Not triumphant, just tired. The particular tiredness of someone who had been telling the truth the entire time and had simply been waiting, helplessly, for someone else to notice. Daniel had promised himself sitting in that gallery as a teenager that if he was ever in a position to be the person who noticed, he would notice. He hadn't expected that promise to cost him quite this much, quite this soon, but a promise made to a frightened 16-year-old doesn't come with an expiration date. Around that same time, something strange happened at Maria's apartment. She came home from another long, fruitless day of job hunting to find a plain manila envelope wedged into the crack of her front door. No return address anywhere on it, no name except her own, handwritten in blocky, careful capital letters that gave away nothing about who had written them. Inside was a single USB flash drive and a folded note that read only, "Ask about Ashcombe." Maria stared at the note for a long time, turning the paper over in her hands as though it might explain more of itself if she simply looked hard enough. She didn't own a computer capable of reading it safely. Her old laptop had died months ago and never been replaced, and she had absolutely no idea who had sent it or what Ashcombe was even supposed to mean. She thought, briefly and with real fear, about simply throwing the whole thing away. About the very real possibility that this was some new piece of the machinery already working against her, one more trap disguised as a lifeline. But something in her, the same quiet instinct that had made her call the police that morning instead of simply walking away with 2 unmarked bags of cash, told her firmly to keep it. To trust that somewhere out there, someone was genuinely trying to help her, even if they were far too afraid to say so out loud, or to show their face while doing it. He almost didn't leave the envelope at all. He sat in his car outside her building for nearly 40 minutes that night, engine off, watching the dark windows of her apartment, running through every possible consequence if this were ever traced back to him. His job gone, his mortgage suddenly unpayable, his wife asking questions he wasn't sure he could answer honestly without terrifying her. But then he thought about the 11 months his mother spent being treated like a suspect by people who'd simply decided, without evidence, what kind of person she was. He thought about how badly he had wished, as a teenager sitting helpless in that courtroom gallery, that someone, anyone, with access to the truth, had been brave enough to hand it over sooner. He wrote the note in block letters so his own handwriting couldn't be identified, wiped his fingerprints off the flash drive out of a caution that felt almost absurd even as he did it, and walked the envelope to her door himself rather than mailing it, because mail could be traced too easily back through a postal route. He didn't knock. He didn't wait to see her face when she found it. He simply left it wedged in the doorframe and walked quickly back to his car, hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive home, telling himself over and over that he had done the only thing he could live with doing. She had no way of knowing it had been Daniel. He had left the envelope himself, late on his way home from a night shift he technically wasn't even supposed to be working. Genuinely terrified of what discovery would mean for his own career and his own family's stability, but unable to sit quietly in his apartment while a stranger's entire life was destroyed for a crime she clearly, obviously hadn't committed. That night, Maria lay awake beside her sleeping son, the small flash drive tucked carefully into the pocket of her coat like a tiny unlit fuse, and asked herself the question that would come to drive the entire next phase of her life. Who was helping her from the shadows, And why were they still too afraid to show their face and simply say so? It took Maria 3 more days to find a safe way to actually view what was on the flash drive. A librarian at the branch near her old apartment, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth, who had been following the news closely and recognized Maria the moment she walked through the door, quietly offered to help, without asking a single intrusive question, plugging the drive into a computer in a small back office tucked away from the public terminals. What loaded onto the screen were internal bank memos. Dense, technical, layered with account numbers and industry terminology Maria didn't fully understand on the first read. But even without grasping every single line, the shape of what she was looking at became devastatingly, unmistakably clear within the first page alone. The $20 million transport hadn't been robbed, and it hadn't been lost to any accident or logistical error at all. It had been deliberately, quietly moved off the official books, disguised in careful internal paperwork as a routine security transport error, in order to cover a much larger, much older shortfall, a shortfall that had been created over years by Richard Colston slowly, patiently, siphoning funds out of client trust accounts, one carefully sized transfer at a time. Maria's hands trembled visibly on the keyboard. This had never really been about her at all. It never had been, not for a single second. And the realization landed in her chest like a physical blow. But that was only the first layer. Buried deeper still in the documents was something even Daniel hadn't fully pieced together yet himself. The $20 million didn't only belong to the bank in any ordinary corporate sense. It belonged, personally and directly, to Arthur Whitfield, the reclusive, 81-year-old founder of the holding company that owned Meridian National outright, a man the public had believed for the past 2 years to be incapacitated, living in total seclusion following a serious stroke, and the money hadn't been lost or stolen in any conventional sense at all. According to a series of encrypted internal notes tucked deep inside the file, the transport had been deliberately, secretly staged by someone with direct personal authority over Whitfield's own accounts, left in a specific, chosen place at a specific chosen time, entirely on Whitfield's own private, carefully guarded instructions. It hadn't been a robbery, or even a genuine mistake. It had been a test. Someone, somewhere at the very top of the entire institution, had wanted to see, with his own eyes, what would happen when an ordinary person found more money than they could ever reasonably imagine. With no cameras watching, no supervisor waiting, no one anywhere to stop them, and every practical reason in the world to simply, quietly walk away and disappear. Maria sat back hard in the small library office chair, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her own throat, and felt the ground shift beneath everything she had thought. Up to that exact moment, she understood about the last 2 weeks of her life. Then came the detail that broke something open inside her chest entirely, permanently, in a way she would never fully close back up again. Cross-referenced quietly in the documents, buried in a compliance file dated 3 years earlier, was a name she knew far better than her own. Marcus Torres. Her husband. 8 months before his death, Marcus, then still a junior compliance analyst, eager and idealistic and proud of the work he did, had been the very first person inside Meridian National to formally flag irregularities in Richard Colston's account activity. He had raised it exactly the way he'd been trained to, through the proper internal channels, quietly, professionally, without drama, trusting the system he worked for to do the right thing with the information he'd carefully gathered. And for his trouble, for his honesty, he had been quietly, deniably discredited and fired within 6 weeks. His internal complaint buried under a deliberately vague policy violation designation, one specifically worded so that no future employer and no future investigator would ever think to look twice at what he had actually courageously found. Maria pressed both hands hard over her mouth to keep from making any sound at all in the quiet library office. For 3 years, she had walked past that glass building nearly every single morning of her life, on her way to catch a bus, never once knowing that it was the exact place that had taken her husband's career, his professional reputation, and, She understood now, with a grief so sharp it felt entirely, brutally new all over again. Quite possibly the last reserves of his will to keep fighting through the difficult final months before that rain-soaked highway took the rest of him from her forever. She had been walking past the very reason her husband's whole life fell apart, for 3 straight years, and she had never known it. Not once, not even a whisper of it. And now, somehow impossibly, that same building, that same money, that same institution, had found its way directly back into her own 2 hands, 3 years later, as though the universe itself had been quietly, patiently waiting to finish a story that had been left unfinished for far too long. Ruth, the librarian, found her sitting motionless in front of the screen 20 minutes later, and gently asked if she was all right. Maria couldn't answer at first. She simply pointed at the screen, at her husband's name buried in a compliance file dated 3 years earlier, and let Ruth read it for herself. Ruth, who had lost her own brother to a workplace injury that a company lawyer had spent 2 years insisting wasn't the company's fault, understood immediately what she was looking at, and what it meant. She didn't say anything performative. She just pulled a chair over and sat with Maria in silence for a while, the way people who understand grief instinctively know how to do. When Maria finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He never told me why he was fired. He just said it was complicated. I let it go because I loved him and because I thought he needed me to let it go." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "He was protecting me. This whole time I thought I was protecting him by not asking, and he was protecting me by not telling me. We wasted 8 months being scared for each other instead of just being angry together at the people who actually deserved it." She copied the files onto a second, cheaper flash drive Ruth kept in a desk drawer for exactly this kind of situation, tucked the original back into her coat, and walked home in the rain without an umbrella. Not because she'd forgotten one, but because for the first time in weeks, she needed to feel something as simple and honest as cold water on her skin. Truth, once it starts moving, becomes deeply dangerous to whoever it happens to be coming for. Richard Colston learned, over the course of one difficult week, that a bank's compliance department has a far longer institutional memory than most executives ever bother to notice, right up until the moment it turns against them. It took him only a matter of days to learn that Daniel Reyes had been quietly pulling old wire transfer records after hours. He didn't need any actual proof of exactly what Daniel had found. The simple fact that Daniel was looking at all was more than enough to trigger a response. Colston moved fast and quietly, the way he had spent 20 patient years learning to move, climbing steadily past people who were more talented and far more honest than he had ever been himself. Within a single week, Daniel received a call from Human Resources informing him, with a warmth that somehow felt almost violent in its practiced insincerity, that he had been selected for an incredible opportunity, a promotion, complete with a substantial raise, at a satellite compliance office 3 full states away. Relocation, he was told cheerfully, would be required within 2 weeks. Daniel understood exactly what it actually was, the moment the words left the recruiter's mouth. It wasn't a promotion at all. It was corporate exile, carefully dressed up in a signing bonus large enough that no one could ever call it retaliation out loud, in a meeting, on the record. He had exactly 2 weeks left before he would be forced out of the city entirely, and out of any real position to keep digging further into what he'd already found. So, in the final chaotic days before his flight, Daniel made a decision he knew could end his entire career if it were ever traced back to him. He anonymously leaked a partial set of the documents he had gathered to a local investigative journalist named Priya Nandan, a woman well known around the city for a string of hard-hitting stories exposing landlord fraud and utility company overbilling. Someone with a genuine, well-earned track record of following threads all the way to their end, no matter how powerful or well-connected the people at the other end of them turned out to be. Priya read through the leaked documents twice before she fully allowed herself to believe what she was actually looking at. She began making phone calls that same night, before she had even finished her coffee. Meanwhile, Richard Colston, feeling the walls closing in around him from a direction he hadn't fully anticipated, decided that the fastest, cleanest way to bury the real story was to make absolutely certain that a different, more convenient story, became official first. Through a political donor connection he had spent years quietly cultivating for exactly this kind of emergency, he applied careful, deniable pressure on the district attorney's office to move quickly, to formally file fraud charges against Maria Torres before public opinion, or any new inconvenient piece of reporting, could possibly shift the narrative away from her and toward him. It worked far faster than even Colston had expected it to. Maria was formally charged with felony fraud and obstruction less than 10 days after she had stood on a small temporary stage, glowing, being called a hero in front of every camera in the region. Her court-appointed public defender, a visibly exhausted man named Gary Doss who was juggling nearly 40 other active cases at the same time, laid the situation out for her plainly one afternoon, without cruelty, but without much comfort either. "The DA's office is moving unusually fast on this one, Ms. Torres. I'll be honest with you, media pressure works both ways, and right now it's working hard against you. Realistically, if this goes all the way to trial and a jury's already seen your name dragged through weeks of headlines before they even walk into the courtroom, that's a serious risk to consider. A plea deal, reduced charges, might genuinely be the safer road for you and your son. I know that isn't what you came in here hoping to hear." Maria sat across from him in a cramped, overworked county office. Innocent, exhausted down to her bones, and utterly alone in a way she hadn't felt since the week Marcus died. And understood, for the very first time, with total clarity, that the plain truth might not actually be enough to save her. That sometimes the system in front of her didn't particularly care what had actually happened. It cared about what was fast, and what was convenient, and who had the fewest resources available to fight back against it. She thought about Eli, about the 30-day eviction clock still quietly ticking down on the calendar taped to her refrigerator, about years of expensive legal battles she could never realistically afford, years that would follow her son through every single grade of school, every new classmate who would eventually Google his mother's name out of idle curiosity and find headlines instead of the truth. For one long, terrible night, sitting alone at her kitchen table with the eviction notice and the plea deal paperwork laid out side by side under the same dim overhead light, Maria genuinely, seriously considered pleading guilty to a crime she had never once committed, simply to make the suffering stop, simply to protect the one person in the entire world she could not stand to watch keep suffering because of her honesty. At the same time, across the city, Walter Higgins, still suspended without pay for nearly 3 full weeks now, his decades of spotless work quietly erased by a single manufactured discrepancy in a shift log he knew, with total certainty, he hadn't gotten wrong, was approached quietly one evening by a bank representative and offered a generous severance package, with one condition firmly attached: a non-disclosure agreement and a polite but very clear request that he stop speaking to any reporters who might come calling in the future. Walter thought about his lost pension from 15 years ago. He thought about every single person who had stayed silent back then, because silence had felt easier and safer at the time, and how that collective silence had let the people truly responsible walk away clean, while nearly 300 families quietly paid the price for decades afterward. The bank representative, a young man in an expensive suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the errand he'd been sent to run, slid the folder across Walter's small kitchen table and said carefully, "This is a generous offer, Mr. Higgins, more generous than most severance packages this size. All it requires is your signature and an agreement not to discuss the details of your suspension or the surveillance review with any member of the press going forward." Walter looked at the folder for a long moment without touching it. Then he looked up at the young man and asked quietly, "Did they send you because they figured an old man on a fixed income would take whatever he could get?" The young man didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I lost a pension to men who thought exactly the same thing about 300 people just like me," Walter said. "Every one of them signed something eventually. Every one of them believed there wasn't any other choice. I watched what silence bought them. Over 15 years, and I can tell you it bought them nothing but a smaller and smaller share of nothing. So no. I won't be signing that." He slid the folder back across the table. Tell whoever sent you that Walter Higgins says he'd rather be broke and honest than comfortable and quiet. I've done comfortable and quiet before. I didn't like the man I became." He signed nothing that evening. He politely, firmly refused the money, at very real and immediate financial risk to a man living on a modest fixed income with no other savings to fall back on. And when Priya Nandan's call finally came through on his phone 2 days later, he picked up on the very first ring, before it had even finished its first chime. She almost signed it. She had the pen in her hand, hovering over the line, when Eli padded quietly into the kitchen in his socked feet, unable to sleep, and climbed into the chair across from her without a word. The way he'd started doing lately whenever he sensed she needed company, even if neither of them said so out loud. "What's that?" he asked, looking at the papers. "Just grown-up stuff," Maria said, sliding the pen down and covering the page with her hand out of instinct. Eli looked at her for a long moment with his father's serious eyes. "You always tell me the truth is worth it even when it's hard," he said. "Even when I don't want to say sorry to somebody, or tell you something I did wrong. You always say it's worth it." He paused. "Is that not true anymore?" Maria felt something crack open in her chest, wide and sudden. She looked at her son, at the plea deal, at the eviction notice still sitting folded beneath the fruit bowl where old habits had put it without thinking, and she pushed the papers away. "It's still true," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "I just forgot for a minute. Go back to bed, mijo. I've got it from here." She didn't sign anything that night. She called Gary Doss first thing the next morning and told him she wanted to fight it, whatever the cost, and if it took every last thing she had left, she would still rather lose everything telling the truth than keep anything by lying about it. Somewhere in the city that same night, an innocent woman sat quietly with a plea deal spread out in her own 2 hands. A 9-year-old boy asleep peacefully down the hall, trusting completely that his mother would fix this, the way she always somehow managed to fix everything. And not a single person watching from the outside could have said, with any real certainty at all, whether the truth was actually going to arrive in time to matter. Priya Nandan worked the way a bloodhound works, patient, relentless, and utterly, completely indifferent to whose powerful name happened to be attached to the trail she was following. Within just a few days of receiving Daniel's leaked documents, she managed to track down a former employee of Ashcombe Holdings, a nervous, soft-spoken bookkeeper named Sandra Ellery, who had quietly quit the company 18 months earlier, after slowly realizing that something about the client consulting fees she processed every month simply didn't add up the way they should have. Sandra had been afraid to say anything publicly at the time, afraid of losing her next job over it, afraid of a company with more than enough resources to make an inconvenient former employee's life genuinely difficult. But 2 full years of carrying that silence, combined with a phone call from a journalist who clearly already had solid documentation in hand, was finally enough to change her mind entirely. Sandra agreed to go on the record, confirming in careful, specific detail that Ashcombe Holdings had functioned, for more than 2 full years, as a deliberate channel for quietly funneling client trust funds out of Meridian National, entirely under the personal direction of Richard Colston. "I used to tell myself it wasn't my business," Sandra admitted to Priya over coffee in a diner far from her old office, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug, like it was the only warm thing in the room. "I processed the invoices. That was my job. I didn't ask where the money actually went after it left my desk, but I used to lie awake some nights doing the math anyway because the math never made sense, and I think some part of me always knew that someday, somebody was going to pay for what I was too scared to say out loud." She looked up at Priya. "When I saw that woman's face on the news, the mother, the one they were calling a thief, I knew exactly what was happening to her, because I'd watched the same machine get built for 2 years. I just never thought it would actually get used on somebody like that." Priya recorded every word, her hands steady even as her chest tightened with a particular fury she'd learned to channel into careful, methodical work rather than useless anger. She thanked Sandra, promised her the article would protect her identity as much as legally possible, and left the diner already composing the opening paragraph in her head. At the very same time, hundreds of miles away, in the last chaotic hours before his forced relocation flight, Daniel made one final decision that broke every single rule he had carefully followed for 8 full years of his professional career. He copied a set of Arthur Whitfield's private internal correspondence. Letters and memos routed through a small, deeply trusted circle inside the holding company's executive office, the kind of sensitive communication that should never have been accessible to a mid-level compliance analyst under any normal circumstances, but that Daniel had learned, over 11 exhausting sleepless nights, exactly how to locate anyway. Inside those private files was a single handwritten instruction from Whitfield himself, dated months before Maria had ever set foot near the 2 duffel bags. If someone returns it without being told, that is the one I want found. He found it almost by accident, buried 3 folders deep in a directory he only had access to because of a permissions oversight nobody had bothered to correct in years. The kind of small institutional carelessness that, in this one instance, worked entirely in his favor. His hands were already packing a cardboard box of desk belongings when the file finished loading, his flight information sitting open in another browser tab, boarding pass already downloaded. He almost didn't open it. He almost told himself he'd already done enough, taken enough risk, and that whatever remained could be somebody else's fight from here on out. But he opened it anyway, because 8 years of training himself to check one more thing before closing a case file wasn't a habit he could simply switch off, even with a plane to catch. Daniel read that single line 4 separate times before its full staggering weight finally settled over him completely. Arthur Whitfield hadn't been testing the bank's security systems at all. He had been testing something far more fundamentally human, and far harder to fake convincingly: honesty itself. In its rawest and most unguarded form. He had, quietly and for reasons of his own, been planning to hand over a meaningful portion of control over his personal philanthropic foundation to whoever proved, without any coaching, without a single camera in sight, without anyone standing nearby to tell them what the right thing to do was supposed to be, that they could genuinely be trusted with a fortune large enough to change their entire life, one they could have simply, quietly kept for themselves. The tragedy sitting at the very center of the entire unfolding disaster was that Richard Colston had never been meant to touch that transport at all. His fingerprints were only on it because he had aggressively hijacked control of the verification process, specifically to hide his own long-running embezzlement inside the sudden chaos of Whitfield's private, carefully guarded test. Now that very same handwritten memo, if it ever became public, would expose in devastating detail exactly how deep his fraud actually ran, and for exactly how long it had been running undetected. When Daniel finally managed to reach Priya from a payphone at the airport, minutes before he was forced to board his relocation flight, the two of them realized, together, for the very first time, that they had each been quietly holding half of the exact same story all along. Priya, with the human cost, the wrongful accusation, the family being systematically destroyed in real time in front of the entire country, Daniel with the paper trail, the shell company, the single handwritten memo that finally explained why any of it mattered so much to a man most of the public had long assumed was unconscious in a hospital bed somewhere, quietly fading away. One final piece of the puzzle confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, just how genuinely alive and alert Arthur Whitfield truly was. Priya obtained public minutes from a regional health board meeting, entirely legal public record, freely available to anyone who knew where to look, that referenced a recent private medical consultation confirming Whitfield remained fully lucid, mentally sharp, and closely, personally monitoring matters related to institutional integrity from the quiet comfort of his private residence. He wasn't incapacitated in the slightest. He had simply chosen, for reasons only now beginning to come fully into focus, to let the entire world believe he was already gone, while he quietly, patiently watched to see who, in his prolonged and deliberate absence, would prove themselves genuinely worthy of trust with whatever remained of his carefully built legacy. The two separate halves of the investigation had finally completely merged into one. And the truth, once fully merged, could no longer be quietly stopped by anyone. 48 hours before Maria's scheduled plea hearing, Priya Nandan published the complete story. The headline ran across every major regional and national outlet within hours of going live. The shell company, the falsified surveillance footage timestamp, Sandra Ellery's detailed sworn account, the carefully documented wire transfers, and, most explosive of everything, Arthur Whitfield's own handwritten instruction, undeniable proof that the entire missing money narrative had been deliberately built from the ground up on a foundation of fraud, designed specifically to protect a single bank executive, rather than a foundation of fact designed to actually catch a criminal. The public reaction was immediate, overwhelming, and total. The very same outlets that had gleefully run Good Samaritan or Con Artist, barely 2 weeks earlier scrambled overnight to publish brand new headlines. The honest woman they tried to silence. Maria's face, once twisted into a symbol of national suspicion, transformed almost overnight into a symbol of something else entirely, a stark, sobering warning about how quickly and completely the truth can be buried by people who simply have more institutional power than they have conscience. Richard Colston, watching his entire carefully constructed life come apart in real time across every screen in his house, made one last, desperate attempt to run. He booked a same-day international flight under a passport bearing a slightly, deliberately altered spelling of his own last name. A small, panicked mistake made by a man who had never once before in his comfortable life had to think like an actual fugitive. It was, in the end, the very same travel account trail Daniel had flagged weeks earlier, already sitting under quiet federal observation, that alerted investigators to the last-minute booking before his flight ever pushed back from the gate. 2 full days after the story initially broke, Arthur Whitfield did something he genuinely hadn't done in over 2 full years. He spoke publicly, in his own voice, to the entire country. His statement arrived not as a polished, stage-managed press conference, but as a short, plainly worded personal letter read aloud in full on the evening news, confirming every single detail Priya and Daniel had painstakingly uncovered together. The test, the embezzlement he had unknowingly given Colston the perfect opportunity to hide inside, and closing with one line that made Maria sit down hard on her own kitchen floor the first time she heard it, unable to hold herself upright a second longer. Mrs. Torres passed the only test that ever truly mattered to me, not the moment she found the money but the moment she chose to call it in instead of simply walking away with it. That is a rarer thing in this world than $20 million ever could be. I am sorry it took so long, and cost her so very much, for the rest of the world to finally see what I saw, immediately. There was more still to come. Whitfield's statement went on to reveal something that no one, not Priya, not Daniel, not even Maria herself, had ever anticipated. The specific morning transport route through the corner of 9th and Kessler. The exact stretch of sidewalk Maria walked down every single day of her working life had been chosen quite deliberately and quietly on Whitfield's own private personal instructions, because it passed directly alongside St. Augustine Regional Hospital, the very same hospital where, entirely unbeknownst to almost everyone involved, Marcus Torres had once quietly, courageously warned a hospital foundation board about irregular billing practices tied to the very same holding company, years before he ever even took his job at the bank. In an act of quiet honesty that had cost him a valued professional friendship with a mentor, but had also, in a small and entirely private way, once earned him Arthur Whitfield's distant, silent, and lasting respect. It was, in Whitfield's own carefully chosen words, a quiet tribute to a man I never got the chance to properly thank while he was still alive to hear it. Maria sat with that single sentence for a very long time. It rearranged the entire architecture of her grief, brick by brick, right there on her kitchen floor. Her husband hadn't lost his career all those years ago because he had done something wrong. He had lost it, 3 quiet years apart from this exact moment, but somehow, impossibly, tied to it all along. Because he had told the truth to people who genuinely didn't want to hear it. And that same unwavering, quiet honesty, passed down to their son without either of them ever consciously meaning to teach it, was the very same quality that had, years later, brought a fortune to his widow's doorstep, and asked her, without any warning at all, to prove that she carried it too. Outside her apartment window that evening, Maria could hear a small crowd gathering on the sidewalk below. Neighbors, strangers, a few of the same reporters who had once shouted questions she couldn't answer, now simply standing quietly, some of them holding candles, others just waiting, as if they wanted to be near the moment even if they didn't quite know what to do with themselves. Once they arrived, someone had left a bouquet of grocery store flowers on her doorstep with a handwritten card that read only, "We're sorry we believe the worst of you. Your neighbors on the third floor." Eli stood beside her at the window, watching the small gathering below with wide eyes. "Are they mad at us again?" he asked, wary, still bracing out of habit for the worst. "No, baby," Maria said, pulling him close. "I think, for once, they finally believe us." She had passed the test entirely without ever knowing she was taking one. And somewhere, buried for years under a mountain of unanswered questions and unspoken grief, she finally, fully understood what her husband had really been fighting for in the last difficult months of his life. The charges against Maria were formally, officially dropped in open court on a gray Tuesday morning, the district attorney reading a brief, carefully worded public statement acknowledging that the case had been advanced under significant external pressure and incomplete information available at the time. Which was, everyone quietly sitting in that courtroom understood without needing to be told, as close to a genuine apology as any government office was ever likely to give. Maria walked out of the courthouse into a wall of cameras. Different now than the ones that had once smiled so warmly at her, quieter and more respectful, some of the very same reporters who had eagerly chased the original tabloid story now visibly, unmistakably ashamed of themselves. She wasn't looking for any of them. She was looking for exactly one person, and she found him standing near the base of the courthouse steps, flanked closely by two federal agents, waiting quietly for a car that would carry him somewhere very different from where he had confidently expected to end up that particular morning. Maria walked up to Richard Colston without raising her voice, without any dramatic gesture, without the righteous fury the moment might have easily deserved. She simply asked him, quietly, the one question that had been sitting heavy in her chest for weeks. "Did you know my husband?" she said evenly. "Did you know exactly what you took from us?" Colston didn't answer her. He opened his mouth once, and then closed it again without a sound, and let his gaze slide somewhere just past her shoulder instead of meeting her eyes directly. And in that silence, in that small, cowardly refusal to look her in the face, Maria got her answer far more clearly than any spoken confession could ever have given her. She didn't wait around for anything more. She turned and walked calmly back toward where Eli was waiting beside a family friend near the courthouse fountain, and she didn't look back once, because she genuinely didn't need to anymore. She had already gotten everything from that man that she had ever needed to get. Colston's unraveling continued at the airport gate not long afterward, where federal fraud investigators finally caught up with him before his flight, booked under an altered passport, could ever push back from the terminal. In one last, desperate act of pure self-preservation, he offered full and complete cooperation in exchange for leniency. And, in the process, made a clumsy, ugly attempt to spread blame onto several board members who, investigative records would later firmly confirm, had known absolutely nothing about his scheme from the beginning. It was a final, ugly attempt to make his own fall feel smaller by dragging innocent people down alongside him, and it fooled precisely no one who mattered. One of the lead investigators, a woman named Agent Cho, who had spent nearly a year building white-collar fraud cases before this one landed on her desk, later told Priya, in an on-record interview, that Colston's attempted cooperation deal was one of the more transparent last-minute deflections I've seen in this line of work. A man trying to trade names for time, without understanding that we'd already done the work he was offering to do for us. The board members he'd tried to implicate were formally cleared within days, their names never appearing in any actual court filing, a small mercy that at least kept innocent people from being dragged through a version of what Maria had just survived. Federal investigators had already built their entire case on solid documents, verified wire records, and sworn on-the-record testimony that didn't require his last-minute cooperation to hold together in court. For Walter Higgins, the reckoning arrived far more quietly, but no less meaningfully for its quiet. Sitting alone in his small apartment, watching the entire story unfold on the evening news exactly the way he had hoped it eventually would, since the cold morning he told a frightened stranger to call the police instead of simply walking away, Walter's phone finally rang. It was Meridian National's newly restructured board, calling personally to formally reinstate him with full back pay for every single week of his unjust suspension, along with a written apology explicitly acknowledging that his original shift log account had, in fact, been entirely accurate all along. Deliberately altered records had simply, criminally made it appear otherwise to everyone looking. Walter hung up the phone, sat alone in his quiet living room for a long, still moment, and allowed himself, for the first time in 15 long years, to genuinely feel like doing the honest thing had actually, finally, been worth every bit of what it cost him. Gary Doss caught up with Maria in the courthouse hallway just before she left, his tie slightly crooked, a rare, tired smile on his face. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've had a lot of clients over the years. Most of them I never fully believe." "I believed you the whole time, Ms. Torres. I just didn't have enough ammunition to prove it fast enough. I'm glad somebody else did." Denise called that same afternoon, her voice thick with relief, already telling Maria that her old position at the hospital was waiting for her the moment she wanted it back, no questions asked, full back pay for the weeks she'd lost included. Per a decision the hospital board had made within an hour of the story breaking, suddenly very eager to be seen doing the right thing in public. Justice, when it finally truly arrived, didn't come wrapped in fireworks or triumphant music. It came instead in the form of a quiet courthouse apology, a wealthy man who couldn't bring himself to meet a grieving widow's eyes, and a 71-year-old security guard finally getting his good name handed back to him in full. For everyone who had suffered through the long, uncertain weeks it took to get there, that turned out to be more than enough. Richard Colston was formally arrested 3 days later on multiple federal counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, deliberate falsification of financial records, and evidence tampering directly related to the altered surveillance footage timestamp. His assets, the house with the perfectly manicured lawn, the boat he rarely found time to actually use, the carefully padded accounts he had spent years quietly building, were frozen within the week, pending full federal forfeiture proceedings. The fall was swift and absolutely total, in the particular way that only a life built entirely on appearances can ever truly fall. Within a single month, the bank foreclosed on the mortgage he could no longer manage to service without his salary. His wife filed for legal separation before the ink on the federal indictment had even fully dried, unwilling to have their teenage daughter's name dragged any further through what the local press was now openly calling one of the ugliest institutional cover-up scandals in the entire region's banking history. At the university 2 states away, his college-age son, once genuinely proud to tell new friends that his father worked in high finance, quietly stopped mentioning his own last name in casual conversation altogether, eventually transferring dorm rooms entirely after classmates began recognizing him from the constant news coverage. He changed his major that same semester, dropped the finance track he'd once planned to follow into his father's footsteps, and told a campus counselor, in a conversation later referenced anonymously in a follow-up piece Priya wrote about the case's ripple effects, that he didn't want to spend his life being the kind of person who explains himself for a living. Colston's own mother, in her 80s and living 3 states away, gave one brief statement to a local reporter who tracked her down at her retirement community. "I raised him better than this. I don't know the man on the news." She declined every subsequent request for comment. The damage rippled steadily outward through the very institution that had once so thoroughly protected him. Meridian National's board, facing a reputational crisis severe enough to genuinely threaten the bank's standing with federal regulators, was forced into a complete top-to-bottom leadership overhaul within a matter of months. 3 separate board members who had quietly enabled Colston's unusual, unchecked authority over the verification process, not necessarily out of any real malice, but out of the same lazy institutional trust that had let him operate essentially unchecked for years, resigned quietly rather than face a formal public inquiry into exactly what they had failed to notice happening right under their own noses. Ashcombe Holdings, the shell company that had sat quietly at the very center of the entire scheme, was formally dissolved by federal court order within the same season. Its remaining seized assets, rather than simply disappearing anonymously into some general government settlement fund, were instead specifically redirected, per a direct, deliberate personal instruction from Arthur Whitfield himself, into something entirely new. A dedicated foundation established in the name of a man most of the public had never once heard of until that very year. The Marcus Torres Fund, created specifically to provide free legal protection and meaningful financial support for whistleblowers throughout the financial sector. People who did exactly what Marcus Torres had quietly done 3 years earlier, and who, unlike him, would now finally have somewhere real to turn for help, instead of simply being quietly, deniably erased from their careers and their reputations. Maria first learned about the fund's chosen name from a lawyer's brief phone call, not from a screaming headline, and she genuinely had to ask the man on the other end of the line to repeat himself twice. Because for a long moment she simply could not process that her own husband, fired, publicly discredited, gone now for 3 long years, was finally publicly, permanently being given the exact credit he had died without ever once receiving in his lifetime. She sat down hard on her kitchen floor that evening, and stayed there for a long time, holding the phone long after the call itself had already ended, and cried the particular kind of tears that only come from a grief that is finally, at long last, being allowed to properly heal instead of simply being carried, silently, forever. Daniel Reyes, for his part, was quietly offered his old position back in the city within weeks, along with a formal internal acknowledgement, carefully worded by lawyers but real nonetheless, that his relocation had been retaliatory. He accepted the return, but not without hesitation. The 11 sleepless nights, the years of built trust in an institution he'd once believed in, had changed something in him permanently. He eventually left Meridian National entirely a year later, taking a position with a nonprofit dedicated to protecting financial whistleblowers. A nonprofit that, in a detail Daniel found almost too poetic to say out loud when he first heard it, was being newly funded in part by the very same Marcus Torres Fund his own leaked documents had helped create. Justice had arrived, in the end, exactly the way it usually does arrive in real life, not all at once, not perfectly or cinematically, but piece by careful piece, name by name, until every single person who had lied was left standing with absolutely nothing but the plain truth they had spent so much desperate energy trying so hard to bury. Arthur Whitfield asked to meet Maria and Eli only the one time. He was not a man given to grand, sweeping gestures, and by the time the meeting was finally arranged, his health had grown noticeably more fragile than his public statement had ever let on to the outside world, a fact he shared with quiet, unguarded honesty the moment Maria and her son sat down across from him in the small, unassuming study of his private residence, sunlight coming soft and gray through the tall windows. He didn't apologize with flowers, or speeches, or any of the polished language a man in his position could easily have hidden behind. He simply looked at Maria for a long, steady moment and said, "I am sorry that my money nearly destroyed your life before it ever had the chance to actually help it. That was never, ever the plan I had in mind. But plans, even careful ones drawn up by careful old men, don't always account for the real people they end up hurting along the way." Maria, who had spent weeks quietly rehearsing every possible version of anger she might feel toward this particular man in this particular moment, found that none of it was left inside her anymore by the time she was finally sitting across from him. Only a deep tiredness, and a strange, unexpected warmth for a stranger who had, in his own complicated and imperfect way, finally given her husband's memory the dignity it had always deserved and never once received while he was alive to see it. Whitfield didn't offer her a check, or a lump sum, or any of the things the public might have expected. He offered her something he seemed to consider far more valuable than any amount of money: a real working position, co-director of a brand new integrity-focused grant program within his own foundation, built specifically around the exact quality he had spent 2 quiet years secretly searching for, and had finally, unmistakably found, in a tired single mother who returned $20 million without a single soul watching her do it. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't a handout dressed up to look like a job. It was a real position, built specifically around the one unshakable thing about her that had never once wavered, not for a single moment, through absolutely everything she had endured. Months passed quietly after that. The cameras, as cameras always eventually do, moved on to chase other stories entirely. Maria and Eli found a new apartment together, modest but genuinely stable, in a building whose landlord had actually taken the time to reach out personally and apologize for what had happened before. An apology Maria accepted with far more grace than most people in her position would likely have managed to summon. On her very first official morning working at the foundation, Maria walked the same familiar route she had walked nearly 1,000 times before, past the corner of 9th and Kessler, past the tall glass building where everything had once so completely fallen apart, and then, slowly, painstakingly, come back together again piece by piece. There were no cameras waiting for her this time, no crowd, no reporters, no flashing lights, just an ordinary gray morning. Soft light easing gently up over the skyline. Her son's small warm hand held firmly in hers. Eli glanced up at her as they walked past the bank's tall glass doors. "Mom," he said, "can I tell people the story someday? What happened to us, all of it?" Maria smiled down at him. A real smile, the kind that reaches all the way up into the eyes. The kind she genuinely hadn't had much use for in a very long time. "Only the true parts," she said. They kept walking together, side by side, unhurried. Behind them, the bank doors closed quietly in the soft morning light, no longer any kind of symbol of everything that had once gone so terribly wrong, just an ordinary building on an ordinary street corner now, the way it probably should have always been in the first place, in her small new office at the foundation, on a shelf just behind her desk. Maria kept two things that had nothing to do with grant applications or budget reviews. The first was a small paper airplane, carefully preserved under a square of glass, identical to the one she'd left at Marcus's grave. The second was a photograph of Walter, taken the day he returned to work at the bank's parking structure, standing tall in his old uniform, with a new laminated badge, and a grin that made him look 10 years younger. He had mailed it to her himself, along with a short note that read, "Some people find $20 million. I just found out my word was still worth something. Feels about the same to me." Maria read it once a week, usually on the hard days, and it never once failed to make her smile. Maria Torres had lost nearly everything trying simply to do the right thing when no one was watching, and in the end, that very same right thing turned out to be the only thing that had ever truly, completely protected her. On the anniversary of Marcus's death that year, Maria did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She took Eli to the cemetery not out of obligation, but because she wanted to tell her husband something out loud, standing in front of the plain granite marker with her son's hand in hers. "They know now," she said quietly. "Everybody knows what you did, and why. You didn't lose. You were just early." She placed a small bouquet of flowers against the stone, the same modest kind Marcus used to buy her on ordinary Tuesdays for no reason at all, and let Eli place a folded paper airplane beside it, something Marcus used to make for him when he was very small, back before either of them understood how little time they had left together. Some inheritances aren't measured in dollars at all. Hers arrived 3 long years late, wrapped tightly in both grief and vindication together. The full truth about the husband she had loved deeply and never fully understood while he was alive, and the quiet, hard-earned proof that honesty, even when the entire world seems determined at every turn to punish it, is still, in the end, worth absolutely everything it ever costs a person to hold on to.
Moral of the story: honesty is never wasted, even when it costs everything before it pays anything back. Maria didn't return the money because she expected a reward. She returned it because that was simply who she was, the same way her husband told the truth to people who didn't want to hear it, even though it cost him his career and, in the end, perhaps his life. The world doesn't always reward integrity quickly or fairly or in a way that feels like justice while you're living through it. Sometimes it punishes you for it first, takes your job, your home, your reputation, before it ever gives anything back. But character isn't built for the moments people are watching. It's built for the moments no one is. Maria's honesty didn't just clear her name, it uncovered the truth about her husband, restored a good man's dignity, protected a whistleblower who might have otherwise been silenced forever, and became something her own son will carry for the rest of his life. In the end, the story isn't really about $20 million. It's about the far rarer, far more valuable thing that money can never buy. A person who does the right thing even when no one would ever have known if she hadn't.